In tonight's Dateline Defense, major developments in Syria. For the first time, President Assad's most powerful ally, Russia, says his regime is cracking under the force of a powerful rebellion. And NATO is now predicting Assad will fall.
I urge the regime to stop violence, to realize what is the actual situation, and initiate a process that leads to the accommodation of the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people.
These comments follow an important meeting in Morocco. The U.S., Europe, and their allies recognize the new opposition leadership. For analysis, we turn to our guest tonight on Capital Insider. Cedric Leighton is a military intelligence officer and retired U.S. Air Force colonel. He's also the president of Cedric Leighton Associates. So Russia now says Assad might lose, but they have not changed their pro-regime stance. Why is that, Cedric?
Well, Morris, I think it's basically one of those situations where the Russians have gotten into the mode that we got into when we supported the Shah of Iran. We couldn't divorce ourselves from him, and they can't divorce themselves from Assad. These statements, though, are significant because this is the first time in a diplomatic sense that the Russians have actually backed away from Assad, and that means a lot internationally, and it means a lot also for the possible movement of Assad out of Syria, and that could be a big boon to the rebels.
This week, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta said Syria has not pushed the envelope on chemical weapons. That said, NATO thinks Assad's forces have used Scud-type missiles. Explain that weaponry, and is it significant?
It is significant. The Scud is basically a missile that was based on the old Russian R-11 missile, which actually traces its root to the German V-2 rockets of World War II. The prototype first flew in the early 1950s, and then by the 1960s, Scud missiles were deployed not only in the old Soviet Union, but also throughout a large portion of the world, particularly in the Middle East. And Syria was one of the predominant customers of that weaponry. It's basically a short-range missile. It's designed to go after a series of targets, but it is not very precise in its targeting. It is a missile that is, by its very nature, lacking in any specific targeting areas. And what we experienced in the first Gulf War were Scud missiles and Scud-like missiles that Saddam Hussein had, and they ended up hitting various targets throughout Israel and Saudi Arabia. Generally, they didn't cause that much damage, but one lucky, in quotation marks, hit ended up killing 22 people from the Pennsylvania National Guard back during Desert Storm.
Cedric, let's turn to North Korea now. They successfully launched a rocket and put a satellite into orbit. What's the long-term concern here?
Well, basically, the North Koreans are flouting a whole bunch of UN rules and sanctions. And because the North Koreans have gotten into this mode of tweaking the noses of the United States and Japan and the South Koreans, obviously, what they're doing is they're trying to make sure that they have a seat at the six-power talks table, which are the talks that are designed to create a more peaceful environment on the Korean Peninsula. The big significance about this missile from a technical standpoint is that now the North Koreans have the possibility of actually using what they've learned during this last launch and also the failed launches like the one in April and previous ones to that, where they can now figure out exactly what they need to do in order to put a nuclear payload on board a long-range rocket of this type. They're not there yet, and they're working toward developing these kinds of rockets, but this was a significant step forward for them.
International leaders condemned the launch. Leon Panetta called it a clear provocation. Is this more tough talk or a precursor to some kind of diplomatic or military response?
Well, I don't think it'll be a direct military response at this point in time, but it could be the precursor for a diplomatic effort to get the North Koreans back to the negotiating table. And because of that, what they're trying to do is they're trying to up the ante against the North Koreans, tighten the sanctions, which are already quite stringent against the North Koreans, and then put them in a position where they are forced to not only deal with the Chinese, but also with the United States, the South Koreans, the Japanese as equal players. And that's something the North Koreans want to avoid. The North Koreans want to have one-on-one negotiations with the United States. We're more interested in keeping them, generally speaking, off of that course and more into the six-power talks.
Switching gears now, Cedric, Express magazine dropped a bombshell last month. The French cyber warfare agency told them the United States hacked former President Nicolas Sarkozy's office earlier this year. Give us some background on this whole Sarkozy thing.
Well, basically what happened, Morris, was that in the period between the first set of presidential elections in France and the second set, which is basically a runoff election, the Élysée Palace, which is the French equivalent of the White House, was hacked. And what happened in this particular case was someone friended a member of the president's staff on Facebook. They then posted a link in a message to that new Facebook friend containing a false website, and that false website looked exactly like the Élysée Palace website. So that then had login credentials on it, and the hackers were able to capture the login credentials from the friended person on Facebook, the friended staffer on Facebook. They used that information then to insert a logic bomb inside the presidential palace's IT system, and that then resulted in the spread of a virus which allowed the people that did this access to information, that sensitive information that they had on the presidential websites and throughout the presidential internet service.
The French, I'm sure, were saying, mon Dieu. The Obama administration calls the claims preposterous. What do you think? I mean, it looks like it really happened, but how far up the chain?
Well, I think certainly the hacking did occur, but in this particular case, it's hard to say exactly who was behind it. The French are saying that the virus that attacked the Élysée Palace system bears the hallmarks of the flame virus, which was used as part of the effort to go after Iran. There's press reporting that the flame virus is basically a U.S.-Israeli co-production. This particular virus has some differences associated with it, but in general terms it's very similar to the flame virus. It is possible, though, that others could have co-opted that virus and gone into the French system and actually used it in order to gather intelligence, gather information on the various positions that the French government was considering vis-a-vis the United States and other countries in a diplomatic sense. So there are a lot of different players here, but to say that it is a U.S. sourced weapon system, cyber weapon system, is probably not exactly correct.
Fascinating stuff. It's always good talking to you. It's like a James Bond movie, but the real deal here.
Yes, it is, Morris.
Colonel Cedric Leighton, president of Cedric Leighton Associates, thanks for being with us on Capital Insider.
My pleasure, Morris. Thanks for having me.